So a while ago I put out a video talking about how circular reasoning is controversially not a logical fallacy. Some of the responses were, well, let's not mince words. Most of the criticism left on that video was so bad it made me dumber just having read it. There were people who didn't know basic definitions. And then there were at least 2 people who told me that they weren't going to watch my video because, of course, circular reasoning is a logical fallacy, so there's no possible way that I could be right. For those of you who don't get the irony in that, circular reasoning is allegedly a fallacy because of presumption. So those comments weren't circular per se, but they are still, "You are wrong because I presume that you are." Point being, there were bad comments, but then there were also good comments that made me think. Specifically, I wondered if I should have said that it is not always a logical fallacy, since the one thing that everyone can seem to agree on is that there are interesting cases like Munchausen's trilemma, where it is no more problematic than any other epistemological framework, but then there are also cases more often where it is a bad argument for rhetorical and epistemological reasons. So I've thought about it, and I wish I could say that I was wrong, especially to earn some internet humility brownie points, but nah, I was right. Although one concession I can make is that I think I structured that video a bit awkwardly, because I think with this issue it's a matter of understanding that 2 things are kind of true at once. And so in this video I would like to walk you through how I ended up resolving this dilemma, and hopefully show you what tends to be the easiest way to resolve most paradoxes and dilemmas in general. Here, the dilemma I faced is as follows. First, we have it that circular reasoning is not a fallacy because a fallacy is a flaw in an argument that makes it so the truth of the conclusion is in doubt. This is what it means when an argument is not valid or not cogent. The truth of the conclusion is not implied by the truth of the premises. And so, why circular reasoning fails to be a logical fallacy is because given its structure, a circular statement ensures the truth of its conclusion given the truth of its premises. If A is true, then it does follow that A is true. For any circular chain, when we claim that the fault is that from whatever point of reference it begins where it ends, then we're saying that the fallacy is that a thing implies itself. But that isn't a fallacy, that's the law of identity. Things do imply themselves. The actual problem has nothing to do with logic, it's a matter of rhetoric and epistemology. From rhetoric, you can't convince anyone that A is true if you begin at the assumption that A is true. From epistemology, you can't know that A is true if you have to already know that A is true in order to learn that A is true. And so, if you want more proof for this first claim, go and watch my first video on circular reasoning, but for all intents and purposes, this explanation and what follows later in this video will suffice as a summary of this concept. The second claim goes as follows. Every statement we make is a statement of our knowledge. When we say something like, "the Earth is round," we are saying, "I know the Earth is round." When I say something like, "circular reasoning is not a logical fallacy," I am saying, "I think circular reasoning is not a logical fallacy." And so, this second claim, as it is a rebuttal to my claim, the first one, goes on to explain that if I concede that circular reasoning is epistemologically flawed, then I have to concede that it is logically flawed. A is true because A is true is understood to be, from the perspective of any and all observers, the claim, "I know A is true because I know A is true." And so, if I concede circular reasoning is epistemologically flawed, since you cannot know a thing before knowing it, then you cannot prove that you know it if you have not already proven that you know it. In short, you have failed to prove it, and the conclusion does not follow from the premise. And that sounds convincing, right? So, which claim is true? Is circular reasoning not a fallacy because A is true if A is true? Or is circular reasoning a fallacy because you cannot prove that A is true? Well, obviously, I've already given away what I think the answer is. This is something that I was confronted with, and it actually kept me up the first night I saw it. But only within a few hours I was able to come to what I thought was a satisfactory resolution. One that controversially stems from what I think is the resolution to most paradoxes and dilemmas. As I've explained this analogy in the past, if I showed you a coin and asked you which side it shows, you would say heads. But if you asked me the same question, you would get a different answer, and hopefully you know why. This side is heads, this side is facing you. This side is facing me, and this side is tails, so I would say tails. The question, which side does the coin show, was not actually a valid question. Which side does the coin show from whose perspective, yours or mine? If we change the question to which side of the coin do you see, or which side of the coin do I see, then there is no contradiction, there is no confusion, and there are clear answers. If we take a ship, take it apart piece by piece, constructing a new ship with all the old parts, and then ask which one is the original ship, as much as this may cause a stir in the philosophical community, the reason people can't concede to a single answer is not because there is no answer. This isn't some complicated paradox. It is simply the case that the question cannot elicit a meaningful answer. What does it mean to be the original ship? Some people will think that it means the ship with the original parts. Some people will think that it means the ship as it continues to be, the one that is manned by the same original crew, has the same original title, and is in all other respects a continuation of the original ship. If I asked which ship is made of all the original parts, or which ship is the ship that carries on the original tradition of that ship, as if it is the same ship regardless of its physical composition, then there is no question or debate as to which ship is which. Now, I do need to make some acknowledgement to the importance of this thought experiment and admit that the question can be interpreted as more self-reflective than I'm leading on here. The question could be seen more as, what does it mean for something to be original? When people have preconceived notions of which ship we are referring to, which interpretation is more correct? But even questions like these become a bit pretentious if we're not looking for a deeply poetic understanding of the universe that looks for meaning and purpose in everything. When we're being essentialists, and I'm sorry, but for lack of a better word, rational, then it's sufficient to say that words are just words. Concepts just reflect things in reality. It's all symbolism, and there is no correct way to interpret these things, as if a rose by any other name is not just as sweet. The idea that these questions, like which is the ship of Theseus, implies some greater search for truth necessitate that all questions are meaningful in that they are pit stops along the journey. And if that is the case, then why should we search for deeper truth? Why should we go on this journey? And if this question is important to that journey, then how do you ever surpass it? Any attempt to answer this question ultimately defeats itself, because if you search for an answer to this question, that implies that you already have an answer to this question. You have already begun the journey despite the fact that this question asks us if we should even start it. It can only be then that a reasonable approach to this world is essentialist, and, as I would call it, circular. As I went over in the previous video, Munchausen's trilemma shows us that any attempt we make at having a complete set of philosophical answers is like a rider trying to pull up his horse out of the mud while he is still riding on top of it. As we just went over, the desire to find a deeper philosophical understanding operates by what you could perhaps call a regressive tendency. It is this desire to go back, not being content in the fact that we just use words to represent things, and instead asking, well, why do we use these words? Is there a correct way to think about these concepts? The problem with this tendency, of course, is that if you're being consistent, then you wouldn't just ask yourself, what is the reason for this? You'd also ask yourself, what is the reason for that, and that before it, and that before that, and so on. This is an infinite regress. If we're never allowed to make assumptions, then we have to go back forever without end, and we can never make knowledge claims. For this reason, and for reasons I have discussed elsewhere, this is the only epistemological framework that contradicts itself, which means it cannot be true. You cannot proceed under this regressive tendency because, most importantly, at some point, if you cannot prove anything, you had to just assume that you should adopt this tendency. Just like when people claim that Munchausen's trilemma proves that knowledge claims are impossible, arguments like these are guilty of performative contradictions, like claiming that it is impossible to prove something as if that is proven, or with infinite regression claiming that it is not acceptable to make assumptions while that is itself an assumption. At some point, you have to make an assumption, or at least I should say at some point things cannot have explanations. They either quote-unquote just are, like definitions, or they are observations. And in this, we either have to concede that we operate from axioms, or from a self-proving or circular epistemological framework. Although even this, I would say we could take a step forward by saying that these two are likely just the same, or at least that one is a weaker interpretation of the other. Often when I make this analytical or symbolic argument, people respond that knowledge claims can be axiomatic, because the claims we make have to mirror reality, either being direct observations or truths that are consistent with reality. If we have the concept or word ball, that isn't just a circular truth defined in terms of words like round. It is a thing we can observe and base in reality. The issue, however, is that while this is true, it ignores the fact that reality insists upon itself in the same way that circular statements do. Things in reality can exist by virtue of other things in reality. They can be caused by other things in reality, and in general they have a common relationship, and that they at least occupy the same reality. Reality is circular in so much as it is consonant with itself, and the same should be true of statements if they mirror reality. And this isn't a flawed epistemological framework, this is actually an ideal one. For example, when we use arguments like the one we used earlier, where we say that the search for knowledge implies that we can assume that the search for knowledge is important, we aren't really making an assumption per se. We aren't just baselessly claiming that the search for knowledge must be important because that is some self-evident claim that just has to be true. When we make strong arguments, we are making if-then statements, checking if those if-then statements are consonant with themselves and with reality, and then approving of anything that can withstand this test. This test ultimately being whether or not a set of facts make a good circle. So when I say that circular reasoning is a superior basis, but at the same time some of this is left up to interpretation, as I said towards the end of the previous video, what I am saying is that yes, we make assumptions or axioms, but it's not as though a good epistemological system contains untested or unverified axioms. So can we even really call them axioms? After all, for axiomatic systems, the best you can hope for is that your knowledge base never confirms nor denies the truth of your axioms. If it denies the truth of your axiom, then how can your axiom be true if, proof by contradiction, it proves itself to be false? And if your axiom by logical extension proves itself, then it is circular. And so if an epistemological framework is not circular or does not contradict itself, then it just does not confirm or verify the axioms. But come to think of it, if your axioms never confirm themselves nor deny themselves by logical implication, then your knowledge base does not contain a proof for all problems. It does not contain an answer for all questions, because then it should contain a proof for your axioms, which it does not. And so maybe you can say that a circular epistemological system begins with an axiom or contains axiom-like facts such as observations, but I wouldn't really consider these to be axioms in the truest sense of the word. A system of belief is going to be reliant upon itself for proof, and this isn't a problem. In math, for example, we don't really have a quote-unquote neat way to find the square root of a number. It isn't like most other operations where you have two pieces of information to deduce the third. You are given just one starting point. Here is this number, find the number that multiplies by itself to make this number. For perfect squares, there is prime factorization, and even for imperfect squares, there is a form of long division that allows you to find most of the number and its remainder. However, with exception to things like continued fractions, there isn't really a way to solve a square root discretely. The most common method is simply to make assumptions and test those assumptions. For example, we know that 1 squared is 1 and 2 squared is 4. The square root of 2 must then be in between 1 and 2. You don't really even have to have a concrete methodology here. We can pick any number between 1 and 2, and when we multiply it together, if that product is lower than 2, then this random number becomes the new lower bound, and if it is higher than 2, it becomes the new upper bound. The only difference having a concrete methodology does is make it so it is easier and quicker to arrive at a meaningful approximation. And so, unless you pick numbers that are really close to the bounds, you should be able to calculate an approximation that is good enough for most uses in just a handful of iterations of random numbers. And you didn't have to do this through some rigid system. You barely even did this without assumptions. All you needed to know going in is if one number was higher than another, which would be akin to making basic observations in real life. You just guessed. You guessed and checked to see if your guesses contradicted themselves, and when they did not, you had your answer. And you can say, what about continued fractions? But it's not as though any of that is going to prove that what we did was not a viable way to approximate a square root, so the point still remains. And as much as I would love to, I probably shouldn't just rant on about math for the rest of this video, especially considering that a lot of what I just discussed has been covered in previous videos. But obviously the point here is to emphasize what we have discussed in those previous videos and help explain how to resolve dilemmas. And so, funny enough, or maybe even frustratingly, here we see that those two goals are actually one and the same. Because how do I say this? I think when people find themselves stuck in a problem, they look for deeper answers. They look for answers outside of the information that is provided to them when they just need to look at that information right in front of them. And in that, I actually find it bizarre that this position I hold is considered more condescending. Like, apparently it is more arrogant for me to think that philosophers of the past just couldn't frame any given situation in a way that they could understand it than it is for you to think that they understood the situation, they understood the puzzle, but they just couldn't solve it. To me, that just evokes images of people sitting around like, I wonder if the square peg goes in the square hole. And so no, I think the easiest way to solve a problem is to realize that the answers are right in front of you. The answer to any problem is just the answer to that problem. Which sounds dumb, so let me explain. Ranting about math just a little bit longer, I think we can understand a sort of strange thing we take for granted in math. If you have x equals x and you tried to solve for x like you would with any other equation, you just get 0 equals 0. And this is kind of a good sign, actually. You see, if we had x equals x plus 1 and we did the same thing, we would get 0 equals 1, and that's not a good sign. That means something here is wrong. You can go back to the first equation and divide both both sides by x and you get 1 equals 1. You can multiply both sides by 2 over x and get 2 equals 2. These are all true statements, and this is because x does equal x. We just don't have sufficient information to say what x is, so for all we know, x could be any of these numbers. However, when we say x equals x plus 1, that's just not true. And hopefully you can relate, or maybe I'm just stupid because I find myself wondering if there isn't some complex formulation we could substitute for x and find that it is equal to itself and itself plus 1. But no, that doesn't exist. This statement gives 0 equals 1 because it implicitly contains it, just as it also contains x equals x. It is x is equal to x, but also 0 is equal to 1 since this side is x plus 0. And 0 is not equal to 1, so this equation has no solution, which you will know if you remember algebra class, but for the purposes of this video, what I'm more interested in are the concepts of abstraction, substitution, and snuck premises, because I see philosophical arguments as being no different. Just as we can use these tools to manipulate an equation and rearrange it into something that is meaningful for us, we may do the same in language, in logical arguments, and in problem solving for day-to-day life. For example, if you've ever lost something, you may ask yourself where the last place you saw it was. But if you think about it, this is actually a pretty absurd question. If you remembered where you last saw it and you were the one that lost it, then you wouldn't have lost it if it was in the place that you remembered it being last. And so when it is not in the place that you remembered it last, it's not as though this information explicitly tells you where it is. Although it isn't as though this method is without merit, and so that's what I mean when I say that an answer is the answer. When we start out with a question, we say that the answer is the thing that resolves the question, and then we manipulate the answer until it is consonant with the question and gives us a meaningful answer. Just like math, you take this side and you understand the hidden premises just like there were hidden zeros. We understand that what we're really asking is, where did I see it prior to losing it? And this isn't meant to give us an explicit and immediate answer, it is an effort to retrace our steps, which we can expand upon. In an equation like 1 equals 1, we can break 1 into a half plus a half, and a half plus a half does equal 1. And so for something like losing an item, we can break the losing that we are trying to retrace into its subsequent parts and remember if maybe we were doing something but got distracted, so we place the item down without thinking about it. So likewise, in more complicated examples, we can come back to something like the ship of Theseus. And here we can see that when we try to pair an answer to the question, we can never make derivations of the answer that make it meaningful without adding additional information, breaking the equivalence. We can reduce something like original to its definition, present or existing from the beginning, first or earliest. But this is like our x equals x equation in so much as the information provided is not sufficient to draw only one conclusion. What should be present or existing from the beginning? The ship? What does it mean for the ship to be present or existing from the beginning? It never gives sufficient information to solve the equation. And so when it finally comes to solving a dilemma like the one we started out with, we have to be able to go through and ask these questions and see if these claims withstand our scrutiny. Hopefully, as I have demonstrated, the first claim must be true, as it is the only way we are even capable of making knowledge claims. So why is the second claim false? Well, a quick nitpick that I didn't even mention earlier is that I have never said that circular reasoning is always rhetorically flawed. It is often flawed, but if you want to distinguish between circular reasoning and consistency, there are instances where circularity and presumption allow us to know things as long as we are humble enough to challenge our assumptions if they are not consistent, like with the example of approximating square roots. We continue refining our approximation if it doesn't give us the correct answer. So in correcting this claim so it doesn't misrepresent the first, it would only follow that circular reasoning could only sometimes be a logical fallacy if it is only sometimes an epistemological flaw. But beyond nitpicking, there's more that's wrong with this claim than just that. For example, remember the tangent that we went on with the ship of Theseus that led us to ask if all questions are meaningful by asking, why should we ask questions? This is really the only tool in our arsenal we'll be relying on. The fact that all statements can be thought of as I know statements sounds right, but is it? What does this mean? What is implied by it? For example, are all statements actually I know, or are they something else? If I say that there is a God and you say that there is not one, are we both making claims of what we know, or are we making claims of what we think we know regardless of whether or not one of us is actually correct in order to say that our knowledge is correct? Well, obviously, it's the latter. We can't both be correct. So all claims are claims of knowledge in so much as they are from the perspective of the person making the claim, but they don't always guarantee proof. So to say that proof has to follow from them is simply not true. If I say the earth is flat, that is not true, but I may believe that it is true. And so if someone holds an irrational belief like this, in saying that knowledge claims have to be proven, we're essentially saying that a claim like, I believe the earth is flat because I believe the earth is flat, has to be proven by another means. But if the claim is irrational or baseless, then what means can prove it? If someone baselessly holds an irrational belief, there may be some desire that motivates them to hold that belief, but other than that, theoretically, for the most part, yes, they do believe that thing because they do if it is a baseless belief, because if it had a basis, it wouldn't be baseless. In really simple terms, with a statement like, I believe it because I believe it, we cannot say that the conclusion does not follow from the premise, because it's not as though that person believes something because of evidence, because of logic, because of reason. No, that person just believes it because that person believes it. So no, when I say that A is true because A is true, and that implies that I think I know that A is true because I think I know that A is true, that does logically follow. It is the case that this person thinks that thing because that person thinks that thing. It may not be sufficient to persuade, and there may be another reason why that person thinks that thing, but A still implies A. This is the law of identity. Likewise, when we consider that the basis for this rebuttal is that our statements are grounded in our perception, such to link epistemology and logic, how would you go about proving the truth of A when the truth of A is an observation? You would say, I saw A happen, which means that A exists or is true, and then I could ask you if all questions are meaningful and if we can abstract language and twist it however we please. Well, how do you know what you saw? Are you going to respond with an explanation of how your eyes work, how vision works? Or will you understand that the question is absurd and that there is no explanation beyond itself? You saw A because you saw A. Once again, A is true because A is true. Just like how when we say that X equals X, the math checks out. It is simply the case that neither one of these statements provides sufficient information to specify the claim. And this is not the same as saying that the structure of the claim cannot imply a true conclusion. X equals X can have infinitely many solutions, and not being able to know what specific value someone has in mind for X or what X means in a real-world application does not mean that X does not equal X. And so yeah, obviously there's reasons why circular reasoning was considered a fallacy in classical dialectics, but by today's definitions, it's not. And I know resolving this dilemma felt like a long walk for a short drink of water, and at times it really took a backseat to discussing epistemology, but that's mostly because obviously, like I said at the beginning of the video, I just wanted to discuss some interesting concepts that I use to resolve problems like this. Also, it's just kind of hard to explain why these concepts are helpful, so since I didn't really have much else to discuss about circular reasoning, I thought it best to just cover these topics here. Likewise, there was a comment that I wanted to address. I couldn't find it in making this video, so I don't remember exactly what it said, but somebody asked me why I accused someone of being guilty of making a circular argument when I made a video that said circular reasoning is not a fallacy, and it's probably good that I don't remember whose comment it was, because I mean, like, not to be confrontational, but there's no one sentence answer to that question. The answer is just the previous video and this one, not just one part of it, the whole enchilada. And this is kind of why I ended that previous video by saying what you want to consider circular reasoning as is a bit up to interpretation, because maybe it would be easier to say that there is logical consistency and then there is circular reasoning. And circular reasoning, although structurally valid, never offers up enough information to know the truth of the premises, whereas logical consistency does. However, far too often I see people abuse distinctions like that. For example, people tend to think that ad hominem means insult, and you can go watch my video on ad hominem because it does not. Ad hom is a fallacy because attacks are irrelevant to the argument, so it's not a matter of the attacks, it's a matter of the irrelevance. In the same way, the structure is the same between logical consistency and circular reasoning. It's just a matter of context. There is a huge difference between someone telling you to assume that logic and reason exist, because if they didn't, we wouldn't be able to reason out that reason doesn't exist, and somebody saying, hey, believe this non-essential claim that is essentially the same as the claim I'm trying to prove in order to prove the claim I'm trying to prove. You know, for example, a claim like determinism is true because all things are the sum of prior material conditions. Well, to be deterministic is to be the sum of all prior material conditions, so that's just a circular argument. If the premise were true, then yeah, the conclusion would follow from the premise, but how am I supposed to know that? It is an epistemological flaw that makes it a bad argument, makes it unknowable, makes it baseless, but it does not make it a fallacy. It does not mean that the argument cannot provide a true conclusion, just that we don't know if the conclusion is true. It is an epistemological flaw that makes it a bad argument, not a logical fallacy. And hopefully these two videos explain what I mean by that, and if they don't, well then, I don't know what to tell you.